welcome back to Firewall. I'm your host, Bradley Tusk. My guest today is Kim Scott, and you're like 3 or 4 guests in one. Like, it's interesting where there's like multiple things I want to talk to you about, and they kind of all fit together in that they're all you, but they're also all kind of different topics as well. So let's just give the audience kind of a brief background. If the name sounds familiar, she's the author of a book that got a lot of attention that I read and loved called Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity. A new book that's coming out. Is it officially out yet?
It's out today.
Out today.
It's about to get a lot of attention.
About to, for sure.
From our mouths to God's ear.
Exactly. Radical Respect, How to Work Better Together. She also is one of the leaders of the Coalition for Concerned Creators, which is a group that I'm involved with as well. But I want to start in a weird place, which is because your bio, and you're aware of it because it's your bio.
It's a little quirky.
In addition to like writing these books and business and all the normal things that a successful person does, you managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and started a diamond cutting facility in Moscow.
I did indeed.
How did those happen?
Randomly. So I studied Russian literature in college.
Okay.
And I graduated in 1990. So my senior year, the Berlin Wall fell, and like all this arms control stuff I had been studying for my whole career the problem seemed to have been solved.
Right,
as it turned out, it wasn't solved.
Really,
unfortunately.
like we didn't just have permanent world peace and happiness.
Yeah, no, but that's what we thought was going to happen. So I'm like, what do I do now? So I moved to Russia, and I was writing a paper on military conversion, sort of swords into plowshares.
And did you move there just because you thought there was an interesting academic opportunity, or was part of sort of the rush to capitalize Russia and lots of people moving there to try to?
No, I definitely, I mean, as I said, I studied arms control and Russian literature. I had no notion of capitalizing.
So if you had only been acted a little differently, you could be an oligarch. Right
yes,
now.
In fact, I remember when they issued the privatization vouchers, thinking, like just doing the math and thinking they've drastically undervalued their economy.
Right. The potash is worth more.
Yeah,
they're saying.
yeah. And I'm like, well, I could go, buy a truckload of cigarettes and trade them for vouchers and and I'm like, that's not what I want to do.
So instead you said, let's open up a pediatric clinic?
Well, no, that was later. So what happened in Russia was I was writing this paper on military conversion, swords into plowshares for Moscow Physical Technical Institute, for which I was being paid $6 a month. That was my first salary. And then this company called Battery March Financial Management came from Boston, and they wanted to invest U.S. pension fund dollars into converting Soviet plants.
Did that strike you as a good idea or a bad idea?
It struck me as a miraculously good idea. I had spent all this time on arms control, and then I was writing this paper for which I was paid $6 a month, and I thought it was just like it was my quirky little thing. And then all of a sudden this real company came in, and they were investing, hundreds of millions. They were planning to invest hundreds of millions of dollars in these converting Soviet defense factories. But then, of course, the coup happened, the Soviet Union collapsed, and they pulled out and went to China. So I stayed in Moscow, and I was trying to figure out what to do next. And like all things, a friend of mine knew someone who needed to have sort of a person on the ground in Moscow to start this diamond cutting factory for a New York-based firm called Lazar Kaplan. So that was what I did next.
And did the people there accept you? You're this young American woman. I assume you spoke Russian, but still.
Yeah.
Did they accept you?
Yeah. In fact, that was my first management experience, was hiring these diamond cutters, because I thought it was going to be easy. I had dollars, they had rubles. The ruble was collapsing. And I thought, I didn't know anything about business. I thought all you do to start a business is you pay people, and that's why they come work for you. That was the
easy.
Yeah. And so I went and talked to them, and I told them what their salary was going to be, and it was going to be like 10 times higher than their current salary. And I thought they were just going to say yes, but they didn't. They wanted to have a picnic. I'm like, all right, well, I can have a picnic too. So by the time we get to the bottom of the bottle of vodka, I realized that what they really wanted was to know that they would have a boss who cared about them, who would get them out of Russia if things went sideways there. And as you can imagine, I've been thinking a lot about these guys.
And did
since
you
then.
have, right, but I mean, obviously you wanted to reassure them, you wanted them to feel like they were coming to a safe environment, but you didn't really have the power to get them out of Russia.
Oh, I
did you?
could have got them out of Russia.
You could?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, it wouldn't have been that hard. I mean, right now I couldn't, but at that time it would have been. It was a matter of buying plane tickets.
Got it. Okay.
I could have pulled out my credit card. I had all kind. At that time, you forget what it was like. At that time in Moscow, if you had dollars, if you ever read the novel Master and Margarita, which if you haven't, I recommend it strongly.
Okay.
But like dollars were magic there. And so yeah, I absolutely could get them out. And that was really the moment that I realized that management was interesting, that capitalism was interesting, that like getting things done and figuring out how to bring a group of people together to collaborate, to work on something together was every bit as interesting as it was. That in fact was the answer to Tolstoy's questions. Was better management.
So you realize you like business, you realize you like management, which really means you like people and psychology and thinking through all of that. And then that's
And I like getting stuff done. I mean, like
right.
there's
And even making money.
yeah.
Sometimes.
I mean, yeah. I think whatever. There's a whole longer thing on that. Yes,
Sure.
but it certainly is good to be able to do what you want to do.
Yeah. So that sparks you to then realize, hey, maybe I want to pursue a career in business, not in sort of military studies academia.
Yeah, absolutely. So then I left, and I left Russia, and I went to business school. I went to Harvard Business School.
Right.
So that was the next step.
And then how did you ultimately, you end up writing this, very popular, I think very, very forward-thinking book. What life and career experiences sort of got you to that point?
Yeah. So after business school, I spent a year at the Federal Communications Commission, also not good preparation for writing a book about management, although it turned out that was a very interesting thing. And then I did 3 failed startups, and then I went to Google. That worked out a lot better.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I think probably a lot of the hard lessons I learned were at these 3 failed startups. And then a lot of the positive lessons I learned at Google.
How long did you stay at each startup before it failed?
So I worked on the one that I founded that I write a lot about was Juice, and that was about a 4-year experience. I was CEO for 2 years, and then I thought maybe someone else would do better, and we hired someone else, and
They didn't do better.
They didn't do any better than I
Yeah,
did.
it's tricky because I know, when we invest out of our fund, in some ways, if obviously we want the company to be really successful, but if it's gonna fail, the best thing for us is to fail quickly.
Yes.
Right. When it hangs around forever and you're using time and resources and capital on it, and there's no money to be made, it's kind of the worst of all worlds.
It is and really, it's interesting. This Juice was in New York. We were actually not far from here.
What did you guys do?
It was sort of the opposite of Google spreadsheets. We network enabled Excel. So if you had an Excel spreadsheet, it would talk to other people who also had Juiced spreadsheets, and they would update.
Got it.
In real time. In fact, the team and I wound up at Google, and the CTO of that company built Google spreadsheets. So it lived on, sort of. But anyway, Juice did not work. We were here, and a lot of our customers were financial customers in the World Trade Center, and we launched on September 10th, 2001. So it was a rough.
Auspicious.
Yeah. It was a rough start. I mean, obviously, much worse things happened that day. And I think we limped along longer than we would have otherwise. We sort of felt like it was our obligation to keep on keeping on. And really, we should have shut it. We actually raised another round right after that. And everybody was like, there was a lot of emotion around that.
Right.
The second 2 years.
Yeah, I can imagine. And so how long were you at Google for?
I was at Google for 6 years.
Okay. And what about the Google experience? Like, when did you start thinking, 1, there's this book that I should write, and 2, here's this thesis that I have that I want to write about? Was that like while you were at Google, or when did that happen?
It was while I was at Google. I sort of realized maybe 4 years into the experience that what really motivated me was not cost per click, although that was doing pretty well. But thinking through how I could build teams where everybody did the best work of their lives and enjoyed working together, where sort of the strength of the individual was the team and the strength of the team was the individual, and that felt good, but also we're achieving a lot of success. And I started kind of poking around at Google. Is there a way to focus on that? And there wasn't really. My day job had to take up 90% of my time, or maybe 150% of my time, and the other, 50% of the 200% I got to. But Steve Jobs at this point was going to start. He wanted to throw away all of their management training and start from a blank piece of paper. And a professor of mine from business school had left Harvard and joined Apple, and he said, why don't you come and help us build this Managing at Apple class? And so I left Google and went to Apple, went from a team of 700 people to just writing and thinking about management and developing this class. And I taught that for a couple of years. And then a friend of...
So what was Jobs, so other than Jobs being Jobs, like he had some realization or view that precipitated all of this, and then what was his view, and then what was the view that you had that shaped the new perspective and approach?
So he didn't have, he was very ill at that time, and so he didn't get deeply, in fact, he didn't get at all involved in managing at Apple. But what he thought was that most leadership training is BS. Mm-hmm. And so let's try to just start from a blank piece of paper and see if we can come up with something that's better. And I just was basing the class on my own personal experiences. I didn't do research. I was just trying to make sense of what had worked for me. And the great thing about Apple is that, like, if I had designed Managing at Google, that class, I would have spent maybe at most 5 hours on the class and then started teaching it. But at Apple, they said, take 5 or 6 months. And I was like, 5 or 6 months? I'm just going to be making stuff up for 5 or 6 months? But that was what really gave me the foundation. It turns out it takes a long time to really figure out how you're going to teach something that you've learned over the course of 20 years.
Right.
And that was really helpful. And then a guy who I had been friends with, Dick Costello at Google, became CEO of Twitter. And he called me and he said, will you help me design a Managing at Twitter class? And of course, it was the exact same thing as Managing at Apple, because people are people. It's also the same thing as managing, a land restoration project.
Right.
Or
so that would be true public sector, private sector, nonprofit sector, different countries.
Obviously, there's differences.
Yeah.
But I think, what do managers do? They create a culture of feedback. They build great teams in service of getting results. And I think that's true. It's also true in religious organizations. It's true no matter, anytime you've got a group of people coming together to work together to get something done, you're talking about management.
So the notion of radical candor hits you, and then how does that turn into a book?
So I helped Dick design Managing at Twitter, and it was kind of when I realized that a lot of people were interested in this. I was his coach, and then a lot of people wanted me to be their coaches. And I'm a person; people don't scale, but ideas do scale. So that was when I sort of decided. In fact, I was taking a walk with Andy Grove, the former CEO of Intel, and he was the one who encouraged me to write a book. He said, and by the way, he wanted to be a writer as well when he was young.
He certainly made enough money that he could have pivoted to it.
Yeah, well, he wrote some great books. But he said that if you write about management, there's just as much drama in that as there is in any novel you could ever conceive.
Right.
And I thought that was a good idea. So
I
sat down and started to write it.
And so at the time, why does it feel like such a disruptive idea at the time? Is it because our norms were sort of designed towards this being polite and being good and behaving appropriately was not being radically candid?
Well, I guess the TLDR is I don't really know why it took. Like I almost didn't even publish the book. I thought I was writing it for the people who wanted me to coach them. It was only because a friend of mine, came and stayed with me, Kim Keating, and convinced me to send it to an agent that I even published it. And I had no idea it would resonate the way that it did, to tell you the truth. I think part of the problem is that we all struggle with this. There was a moment when I was CEO of Juice, of the software company here in New York, when about, 10 people at the company sent me the same article about how a person would rather have a boss who's a total asshole but really competent than one who's really nice but incompetent. And I thought, gosh, are they sending me this because they think I'm an asshole or because they think I'm incompetent? And surely those are not my two choices. And I think a lot of us struggle with that, with some version of that. Like, we do want to be kind people, and we do want to get shit done. And you can do both. And I think that was it. And the basic 2x2, like I went to business school where I learned exactly nothing about managing people. I don't think they teach that really. They teach, finance or whatever. But the people part, managing human beings, they do not teach at business school. But they did teach me that a good 2x2 framework can solve all of life's hardest problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you're advising your clients and you're writing this up, and people are trying, and everyone's like, oh, this works much better? Or are people like, holy shit, Kim, I did what you said, and now everyone's mad at me?
No. But people generally will say, this is a huge relief. This works 9 times out of 10. But I don't want to overpromise. Like 1 time out of 10, there's a radical candor train wreck.
And when do you, so let me give you an example, totally random one. But yesterday, someone asked me to talk to their friend's kid who wants career advice. She's graduating from law school and tells me she wants to work in the democracy space. And by the way, I have a nonprofit in the democracy space, but I said to her, try to understand what her goals were.
Yeah.
It's like, you're wasting your time. I said, you're going to be such a minor player in an organization that is so at the fringes that, yes, it'll look good on your Twitter bio, and yes, people congratulate you at cocktail parties, but if you truly want to get things done, like my service, go work in government where actually you can run things and do things. And it was not what she was expecting, right? Mm-hmm. Now, my view was, if I'm going to spend a half an hour, why not try to actually be helpful? And that just telling her what she wanted to hear wouldn't be helpful. But at the same time, arguably, I was borderline impolite, and the person who asked me to do them a favor, now instead of it being a favor, they're like, what,
Why were you mean to my kid?
Yeah, why were you mean to this kid? And yet it still felt like the right thing to do. And I tried to be as nice as I could in talking about it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm a pretty blunt, candid person by nature. So what was the right move? Should I have done that? Or should I have just said, yeah, it's great. You should talk to these 3 people, and then just kind of gotten off the phone?
Yeah. So I think you should say what you think. Like that is the idea of radical candor. But I think it's also important to pay attention to how your words are landing. Like being authentic does not mean ignoring the impact you're having on others,
right?
Which it doesn't sound like you did in this case. But what I try to do is when the person seems sad, or even if the person seems mad, like that's my cue to show that I care personally. Radical candor means care personally and challenge directly at the same time. So I don't back off on my challenge, but what I do is I take an extra beat and say, it seems like you're disappointed by what I'm saying. Tell me what you're thinking. Because you want to remember that it's a dialogue, it's not a monologue. And so it's all about like choosing the right vector. If you think of radical candor as a 2x2 framework, on the vertical axis is care personally, on the horizontal axis is challenge directly. If the person is sad or mad, you want to move up on care personally. If the person is brushing you off, which actually is more likely to happen, then you want to move over on challenge directly.
Right.
So it's about sort of making sure that you're moving around on this, and say, look, I'm happy to make introductions to you, but I care about you, and I want to tell you why I think this is not the right move for you to make at this time.
Right. Hopefully that's what got across.
Yeah.
So, it feels like there are these two competing societal values of, I'd say most people in business at this point would just say, oh yeah, radical candor makes sense, right? And I think we also know from, all kinds of different media personalities and politicians, the people who are more candid and vulnerable tend to actually do better than the people who are super guarded and speak in sound bites.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we also live in a world where it is very easy to be canceled if you say something in a way that someone else decides is offensive, which obviously their basis for that is what's good for them, not necessarily what actually is or not problematic. So if people are, especially these sort of high-profile CEOs who are, every time if they do misspeak in public, there's some real risk and maybe even some stock price impact on that thing. How do you guide them to be kind of use radical candor and yet not step in landmines?
Yeah. So again, radical candor is mostly about relationships between people, not public speaking.
Yeah.
But obviously, I think it is important to be radically candid in public as well. The problem is if you're trying to pay attention to how it's landing for a person and you're speaking to 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 100 million people, it's going to land differently for all those 100 million people. And so
right.
you've sort of got to decide, what's the best. Like, for example, I'll give you an example. I often give talks, and I tend to swear like a sailor. But I don't drop an F-bomb if I'm talking in front of an audience, because somebody's going to get upset by that, and it's not worth it to me. I mean, like, the F-bomb is not essential to who I am as a human being. So you can adjust your language in a way that is helpful. What I recommend to people who are speaking in public a lot, and this I talk a lot about this in Radical Respect, is to hire a bias buster. When I wrote Radical Respect, I was trying to write this book that was inclusive, and the last thing I wanted to do was to use language that was going to make people feel excluded or pissed off, and so I hired someone to read the book and point that kind of language out to me, and it was very helpful. There was a moment. There were like 8 words that I tended to use that this person pointed out to me. I could adjust my language, and one of them was blind. I tended to say I was blind to when I meant I was unaware of. And there was a guy who was editing the book who is blind. And so as soon as my bias buster pointed this out to me, I was like, oh gosh,
That's why he hates me.
No, I knew he didn't hate me. But I knew I wanted to fix it.
Yeah.
And I thought I had become aware of it, and I thought I had fixed it. And then I thought, before I turned the book in, I did a quick search. And in a 300-page book, I had used, after I had been made aware of this problem, sloppy sight metaphors 99 times. So, you really gotta kind of work on this stuff. And it was my initial instinct when she gave me this list of 8 words. I was like, no word in the English language is safe. I had the, and then I'm like, okay, take a beat and really run the numbers. That's 8 of 200,000 words that I needed to adjust.
So what happens from writing Radical Candor becomes a big hit that then leads you to develop the thesis for the book that's coming out today?
Yeah, so if you write a book about feedback, you're bound to get a lot of it. And indeed I did. So I was at a tech company in San Francisco giving a Radical Candor talk, and the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, a person I like and respect enormously, and she's also one of too few black women CEOs in tech. And when I finished giving the talk, she pulled me aside and she said, Kim, I'm excited to roll out Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer anybody even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, she would get signed with the angry black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true as soon as she said it. And I had sort of 4 realizations at the same time. So it was a powerful feedback moment. The first was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be, that I want to be. I had failed even to notice the extent to which she had to show up unfailingly cheerful and pleasant in every meeting we were ever in together, even though she had what to be pissed off about at work, as we all do. And I hadn't even noticed that. So I had failed to be an upstander. And I kind of designed this book around these roles, about what, how can you intervene as an upstander. The second thing I realized was that not only had I been in denial about the things that were happening to her as a black woman in the workplace, I was also in denial about the kinds of things that had been happening to me as a white woman in the workplace. Kind of hard for the author of a book called Radical Candor to admit, but there it was. And I think I had been in denial because I never wanted to think of myself as a victim. Mm-hmm. But even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim did I want to think of myself as a culprit. So the third thing I realized was that I was most in denial about the times when my disrespectful attitudes or behaviors had made it harder for my colleagues to get their work done. And then the fourth thing that I realized was that as a leader, I imagined I was creating these BS-free zones where everybody could do the best work of their lives and enjoy working together. And yet, by pretending that these things were not happening, I was not able to prevent them from happening. So that was kind of what sent me down the path of writing this book. And it wasn't, that was probably the moment, but there were also a bunch of other moments. Another guy I know who was working at a company where I was doing some work told me that he had a colleague who was a colleague in marketing who was launching a new campaign. Okay. And it was called Rolling Thunder. And he came and he told me, he said, I failed to be radically candid with her because I was afraid if I told her the history of Rolling Thunder, which if she knew it, I figured she wouldn't have chosen that, right. that metaphor for her marketing campaign. But he said, I was afraid she would say I was mansplaining or call me an asshole or whatever. And so I didn't say anything. And I felt bad because I knew that he wanted to tell her. And I also knew that she would have wanted to know. Yeah. But this is kind of what you're talking about. People are now so afraid to talk to each other that that they sometimes don't talk. And that is a disaster for not only for a successful business, but for successful relationships.
Part of the point that you're making is that you can be respectful, empathetic, and yet direct and candid all at the same time. And you should be. And by being all of those things, you will be far more effective. As a society and as a culture, do we treat each other better in the workplace than we used to? Or are we the same? Have we become more empathetic generally?
That is an excellent question. I think it depends on who you're asking. I think that there was a notion of collegiality that used to exist for some people, not for all. Like I would have been excluded from the collegiality in the 50s and 60s, and in fact, the majority of people were excluded from that. So right. The question is, can we get back to that collegiality, but make it more inclusive? And that's the hope, right. I think.
But I do think that, I even just think about my career, start working in the 90s to where we are today, and the ways that bosses that I had would speak to me or speak would never be.
It wouldn't happen today. I think that there's a reason why Radical Candor started in Silicon Valley. In addition to the fact that I happen to have
write a book
there.
About it, yeah.
Yeah, but I think that the competition for talent was so incredibly tough there, and I think you and I agree that people join companies and they leave managers, and companies began to realize that they couldn't afford to have these managers who were jerks. Yeah. And I also think that there was, like Shona Brown, who led business operations at Google and designed a lot of the management systems there, very consciously stripped power away from managers. You didn't have unilateral decision-making power over who you hired, who you promoted, who you gave a bonus to, who you fired. And that was really important. I think absolute power corrupts absolutely. A little bit of power corrupts a lot. and I think that increasingly companies are realizing that they need to teach managers how to be better managers and not just give them a lot of power and hope for the best.
So while I agree, and hopefully, of course, the employees in this room aren't going to, tell me otherwise, but like,
I bet they would, because you're so good at soliciting feedback.
Hopefully, run companies where people both feel respected but also motivated. So I get the notion, and I generally believe the notion that if people are happy at work and they're motivated and they like their colleagues, they're going to do a better job. Full stop. I get it. Part of me, I guess the part of me from like when I was the young person working, still wonders like, well, when I, the bosses that were these insane taskmasters, right, that were just pushing. Yes, I hated them. Yes, I couldn't wait to leave whenever I got whatever I thought I needed to get out of the job. But was the overall work product better? And if so, is that better or worse? I still would argue that everyone having a level of, not hating their job is probably more important from a macro perspective than getting 10% more productivity. But part of me still has this sneaking suspicion that there is productivity left on the table because of the cultural shift.
I think that, I think this goes back to that story about, am I an asshole or am I incompetent? Like, I think that's a false dichotomy. I will say that in the choice between, let's go back to the radical candor framework. Care personally, challenge directly. When you do both, it's radical candor. When you care but you fail to challenge, that's ruinous empathy. And I think that's kind of what you're concerned about. It's not radical candor, but ruinous empathy. And then in the bottom right-hand quadrant where you challenge but you don't care, that's obnoxious aggression. And I will say that I think probably obnoxious aggression does get better results than ruinous empathy does. However, those are not our two choices.
Right.
We don't have
to.
So
what's the ideal?
Radical candor, where you do care about the person, and not only do you care about the person, you show the person that you care, and you still challenge them directly and push them really hard. And I think it's also different people like to work differently, different work styles. And I think it's important to create an environment where, because like part of it is work hours. There was a team I worked with when I worked at Apple, and this team worked 100 hours. I mean, I've never met a team that worked so hard. And they were all miserable. Yeah. And I remember asking someone else at the company, like, why are they doing this to themselves? And she said, well, because they like it, And then I realized that they weren't actually miserable, but I was projecting myself. I would have been miserable working that way. And so that was very liberating. I was like, okay, if that's the way you want to live and work, then awesome. That's okay. I'm not going to do it, but I'm not going to tell you you cannot do it. There was another guy who I worked with at Google, and he worked really hard, but he needed 2 months, and he would just go on a bender.
Drinking?
All around the world, drinking, taking photographs. I don't know what all he was doing. But this was part of his was part of his work. And he did, so it was my job as his boss to mangle the HR systems at Google so that he could go off and do this, so that he could come back and do great work,
And I assume Google was the kind of place that was able to basically get that and kind of give you the ability to mangle the systems.
Even at Google, which prided itself on it took some doing, but we made it work. We got it done.
So then in the middle of all of this, when did you start writing this book?
I started writing this book when I left Apple. I decided I'm gonna coach a few people, and I'm gonna write this book. And I thought it was gonna take me 3 months. I was like, I've taught this class, I have all the ideas, the structure.
Yeah, right.
I've already spent that 5 months. It took 4 years.
So what year did you leave Apple?
I left Apple in 2012.
Right. So then for Radical Respect. you
I started writing that in 2017.
17, right?
Yeah.
And then so here's my question, which you're anticipating, which is this really big thing happens in between, which is COVID and work from home.
Yes.
Right. And so.
And Me Too and Black
Right.
Lives Matter.
Right.
Like,
So
there was a lot.
So how does that, and especially I think kind of work from home, because I think all of us who are managers still struggle with this,
Yeah.
especially if you're a little older and you're like, well, I know we're just as productive, our revenue is up, but shouldn't more people be here?
Yeah.
How did that change either the book or your thought process around it, if at all?
Yeah. So when I was working at Google, I had teams in 20 different countries. So I was already it was a hybrid.
Right.
I mean, we were in offices, but we were not all in the same place. And in fact, when I started my career, when I was doing the diamond cutting factory, I was in Moscow, my boss was in New York. So I had a lot of experience working remotely, I guess. And Radical Candor, the company that I founded with Jason Rosoff to help teams roll out the ideas, had always been sort of hybrid. So for me, the thing that changed was watching all these other people sort of struggle with hybrid. There's no one right way to work. I mean, I think there are some people who really crave being together and really benefit from being in an office together. There are other people who do not. And I will share my bias so that you can bust it. I'm one of those who do not. I love hybrid.
Right. Do you feel like you are genuinely as productive in that environment?
Way more so.
Do you think that's the norm or that's you?
I mean, I think what is average is irrelevant because nobody is average. You know, it's like there's a book
But
about
if you have a business, to a certain extent, you have to set policies based on sort of the macro, right, or at least lowest common denominator.
No, I don't think you want to you don't want to optimize for the lowest common denominator, right, for sure. I think what you want to do is you want to create norms and flexibility within those norms. That is, or you want to say, we're a company that works in person and you have to be here. I mean, I think that is a perfectly reasonable thing to do and to say, but you got to realize that that's going to make your recruiting and retention a lot. It's going to
impacts it.
Yeah. I mean, but it is. There's no reason why someone who feels that it's really important for the kind of work they do, or even like, if you are starting a company and you really want people around you in the office, like, right, you get to make that decision.
Right.
But you just need to own that decision.
Right. And some of it's like, I know that I struggle with this bias where. I know based on I have metrics, so I know how we're doing, right? Yeah. And yet at the same time, I also know what I pay in rent.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm there and I feel like, I'm one of, like on a Friday, I'm like, I've literally been the only person. I'm like, what the fuck? Like, spending all this money, there's no way everyone is working as hard at home today as I am here in the office. And like, how much so for?
But I think let's question
right.
that.
That's the question.
That's a bias.
Right. So part of me feels like, that's a bias, and I need to come to terms with it, and I also need to accept that the workplace has changed, norms have changed, and I have to change with them on some level. And then part of me says, there's voice in the back of my head that says, that's all bullshit. If everybody was here and everybody here for this number of hours, they'd be working harder and we'd get more done.
If they were all here, you'd be like, wondering who's on YouTube, who's who's on their personal email. There's like a million ways to waste time, and so I think that the key thing is and yes, if you're paying rent, it's annoying if nobody's there, but like the answer is not to make everybody come in necessarily. The answer is maybe
just suck it up. But
or not to have as grandiose an office. Have a smaller situation.
I mean, I think that's especially here in New York. You're seeing the commercial real estate industry really start to grapple with that.
Yeah.
Right? And people also, like I was walking around Hudson Yards the other day. And the rents there are incredibly high, like $130, $140 a square foot. But I think the reason why you see a lot of companies moving from Midtown into Hudson Yards is they're saying, okay, I'm going to have higher rent, but it's better and newer, more modern, all
Yeah.
stuff. I also need less space, right? So
Yeah,
I
so
could
I can
ultimately
afford-
have
yeah.
more. So I could afford it because I have a much more flexible
Yeah.
environment, right?
Yeah.
And then of course the bill hasn't really come due yet for the
Yeah.
economy on that, but
Yeah.
I think it's coming.
Yeah. We'll see what happens. I think it's going to be painful. It's going to create some adjustments for sure. But like we have demonstrated that we're pretty good at adjusting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a sort of at least in cities like New York, San Francisco, where there's this desperate need for affordable housing.
Yeah.
Clearly, if they can figure out some cost-effective way to convert,
Yeah.
that would get
It
taken
would-
up
it would
quickly,
be
right?
huge.
Yeah, if you could turn all
Yeah.
those buildings in Midtown Manhattan that don't need to be
Into
offices into
apartments,
apartments,
yeah.
people would want that, right?
Yes,
There's no question.
100%.
The demand exists, whether you can do so, but economically efficiently, both given the market and then given all of the externalities of New York,
Yeah.
all the politics, all the extra
Yeah.
regulation. You have to build everything union. You have to have 50
Yeah.
different environmental reviews.
Yeah.
Every community board has to
Yeah.
sign off. You put all those things together, and all of a sudden, what might be affordable doesn't stay affordable.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's right. So let me go to the next topic, which is a group called the Coalition of Concerned Creators that you and I are both involved in. You kind of caused a big stir when you wrote this op-ed for the Times about it. And you've become sort of an expert on the economics of the book industry, in part because it's now partly the economics of your life. And you feel like Spotify is taking a position on audiobooks that really does potentially impact the economics for authors. What are you concerned about?
The problem is that Spotify immediately sort of cuts in half. Like on average, people complete half a book when an audiobook.
Yeah.
They don't finish it. And right now, if you buy an audiobook on any other platform, you pay for the audiobook whether you finish it or you don't finish it.
Right.
And Spotify is looking to eliminate that. And it seems to me that imagine if you could, if all of the people who bought books in a bookstore could return them and demand half their money back if they only read half, or
we lose enough money as it is.
Yes, yeah, it would be untenable. It would be bad it would be really bad for the bookstores. It would also be bad for the authors. And so so that's like the basic problem.
So why is Spotify doing this then?
Well, because they can. Because at some level, it seems like, oh well, that's fair to readers. But the problem is that the reason they're doing it is because it is a way for them to lower their costs without hurting their revenue on the backs of authors. And I'm not sure exactly what the economics for the publishers will be, but it, for the same reason that Spotify did what they did to musicians,
right.
Because they kind of could. And I felt like I had an obligation to write about this because when I worked at Google, one of the things that I did was I led AdSense and YouTube and DoubleClick online sales and operations. So I have a pretty good idea of how these online networks work. And so it's sort of three mutually reinforcing network effects. You've got users, and the more users you get, the more you get. And then you've got content, and the more content you get, the more users you get. And then you've got ads, and the more ads you get, the more content you can afford to get, and then the more users you get.
Yeah.
So imagine like an infinity with an extra circle in it.
Right.
And once you've got those network effects going, and you're in a capitalist economy, it's almost inevitable that you're going to start putting the squeeze on the content creators because that's the logic of the system. It's what Dr. O calls enshittification of the internet.
And where's the line? So I would imagine that if Spotify were having a truly honest conversation, they would say, okay, we just care about profits. We just want the best quarterly earning calls we can have.
Well, I mean, of course.
Right, they're a business.
Yeah.
Got it. They have fiduciary duty to shareholders.
Yeah. If they didn't do that, they'd get
Right.
taken over. So.
At the same time, if you strangle the market to the point where the content that you are marketing to your customers is no longer being created because you've made it so unappealing and so uneconomical that people choose to stop doing it,
Yeah.
that's also a problem, right? So I would imagine
But that's a very long-term problem.
well, that's the thing, right? I guess if I'm, Spotify, I'm saying, you know what, writers are going to write, musicians are going to make music. Doesn't matter how much we take the money away from them and keep it for ourselves. The content will always be there because that's just sort of who they are. I mean, is that a fair assumption for them to make?
No, it's not a fair assumption at all. I mean, if you look at the music industry, you're seeing that there's less new music being created now than there was. I mean, it's already bad for writers. I mean, it's already really the capitalism. I wrote a novel called The Measurement Problem, which is all about how capitalism is really good at rewarding what it can measure and really bad at rewarding what's valuable. So it's already like we're already screwed as artists and writers and
Awesome.
yeah. So it's like already not. I don't want to put all of this on Spotify. It's like there's a broader problem, and in fact, part of it, like when I got a pretty good advance for Radical Candor as far as advances go, but I could never have afforded to live on that for the 4 years that it took me to write that book. Right. And I got, probably as a function of being white and having gone to these schools and worked at these companies, I got a better advance than other. Like, the only reason I could afford to write that book was because I had sort of won the lottery a couple of times in my career, as had my husband, So can we only afford for independently wealthy people to create? No, we cannot. Like, that's a tiny...
Right. Plus the content's going to suck.
Yeah, exactly. So we need everybody who wants to write to be able to write. We need people who want to create music to be able to create that music. We need artists in our society.
Okay. So you're part of this group. I'm part of this group. How do we actually stop Spotify from devaluing audiobooks to the point where, one, authors make a lot less money, and two, long term, it incentivizes less creation?
I think that one thing to do is to talk to publishers. I think that publishers can stop this. It's going to be much easier for the publishers to put a stop to this. And Macmillan did do a good. They came to me and they said, "Do you want to participate?" They didn't say you have to participate. So I appreciate my publisher for doing that. So I think that's part of it, putting pressure on publishers. I think that this probably, you're not going to love this answer, but I think unfortunately we need some regulation at this point.
No, I'm not.
Because what I don't want to do is make people feel guilty for listening to books on Spotify. Like consumer guilt is not the solution to this problem. I just want to say, there's too many damn things that I feel guilty about, and that everybody feels guilty about. And I think asking Spotify not to behave in the way the market incents them to behave is not realistic.
Right.
Kim, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So I listen to books on Spotify, and I loved it when I found out that they offered, like all these great books, and included in my normal plan. And I still have my Audible subscription, but I keep thinking I need to cancel it. Audible's owned by Amazon. Is that a better system? Do they operate in a way that's more beneficial to creators?
So Amazon, yes. I mean, at least you buy the book, you pay for the book. Amazon pays the royalties to the writer. So it is a better system, for sure. And I listen to Audible all day long. There are, I want to say, a lot of other options for listening to books. Which I'm starting to do more of. So independent bookstores have banded together, and they've created an alternative to Audible. So there's a lot of different, and you can of course use Google Play or Apple Books. So there's a lot of different ways for you to listen to books. So I want to encourage folks to explore those. You can also get books from the library if you can't afford those options. So there are, and I want everyone to read. Like if you can't afford to buy my book, I want you to check it out at the library and read it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Final thing, sometimes we close these with like a recommendation. It could be something fun that you have read or seen or watched or eaten or visited. But given that you travel a ton, and just given that our listenership is all over the place, what's one thing?
One thing, the thing that I have done lately that has given me so much pleasure is getting out and taking hikes in open space preserves or in national monuments where there are very few other people. So I hate to give this recommendation because now there'll be too many, but Carrizo Plains National Monument in California. Yeah. I know now.
We'll consider it a wonderful success if that place is mobbed tomorrow.
But it is, you go to the visitor center there, and the nearest gas or water is an hour and a half drive away. And you can just camp. You can really go and be in nature. And I think that those kinds of hikes and walks in the middle of nowhere give me a lot of pleasure. So I recommend that.
Awesome. Kim Scott, the new book is called Radical Respect, How to Work Better Together. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Firewall is recorded in my bookstore, P&T Knitwear, located at 180 Orchard Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. We'd love to hear from you with questions, feedbacks, or idea for a guest. Just email me at bradley@firewall.media or find me on LinkedIn. And to keep up with what's on my mind and my latest writing, please follow my new Substack at bradleytusk.substack.com. Thanks again for listening.